All right, so today we're going to be looking actually at two different sets of revolutions, the 1830 revolutions and then the 1848 revolutions. So we've been seeing liberalism, conservatism fight. Europe's been shaking up that soda bottle, and now that soda bottle is going to explode. So this can get very complicated. So there are some key themes and trends to keep in mind here. So both sets of revolutions, 1830 and 1848, are going to start in France, and then they're going to spread to other places in Europe, notably not Britain. So keep an eye on that. Then, second trend, liberalism and nationalism are going to play a role in both sets of revolutions, although nationalism is going to play a bigger role outside of France. So really keep an eye, especially on those countries that we've talked about that are already kind of starting to look towards unification. So like the German states, for example, keep an eye on countries that are under the control of other countries like Poland. Nationalism is going to be a really strong driving force here in addition to liberalism. And then, spoilers, third trend, most of these revolutions are really unsuccessful. They don't change a lot of things. But what they do is they lay a foundation for either greater political participation or new constitutions. And in those countries where nationalism plays a really strong role, it lays a foundation for national unification. So keep those themes and trends in mind as we go throughout this. All right. So as we mentioned, right, all these revolutions are going to, these two sets are going to start in France, and then they're going to spread elsewhere. And we actually sort of led into the 1830 revolution. We talked about Charles X in the last lecture. So as we know, right, the King of France right now, Charles X, is super conservative. Nobody really likes him. He increases censorship. He limits the right to vote. He dissolves the legislature when they don't listen to him. France has learned how to deal with kings like this. You overthrow them. So in July of 1830, liberals took to the streets to protest his actions. And so the revolts of 1830 in France are also called the July Revolution. So this is actually successful. Charles X flees. He goes to Britain, and then he's actually succeeded by his cousin, King Louis Philippe. So we still have a monarchy here. Louis Philippe is an interesting guy because he's actually pretty popular with some liberals. He's pretty well supported by the upper middle class, and we know the middle class tends to like liberalism. And so as a result, he gets the name the citizen king or the bourgeois monarch because this is kind of his base of support. Now, he does actually have some liberal policies-ish. He does extend voting rights, but for the most part, voting is still only accessible to the wealthy. And then he kind of leaves out, like some liberals do, the living, so basically the poor. He doesn't really improve the living or working conditions of the poor. Kind of a fun fact about Louis Philippe, he was a very popular subject of political cartoonists because he was a little funny looking. I think he looks a bit like Elvis, but there's a very famous French political cartoonist named Daumier, and he thought that Louis Philippe looked like a pear. So he drew him like a pear all the time. And actually, funny story about this. So Louis Philippe did actually practice censorship. So he did have that sort of semi-conservative policy. And one of the ways people got around censorship is they drew Louis Philippe as a pear in honor of Daumier. And then whenever the censors came after them, they're like, you can't make fun of the king. They're like, I'm not making fun of the king. I'm drawing a pear. Right. So that's France. The 1830 revolt in France spreads across Europe. So it spreads to Belgium, Poland, and Italy. And there's a fun quote about this. So Metternich, our favorite conservative, said when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So France is really the revolutionary typhoid Mary here. But what's interesting about Belgium, Poland, and Italy, as I mentioned, right, is there's liberalism. That's playing a role here. We see people wanting greater political participation, but nationalism is also going to play a really big role in these revolts as well. So let's talk about Belgium first. So kind of scrolling backwards a little bit, at the Congress of Vienna, Belgium actually got put under the control of the Dutch Republic, right? Remember, all the way back last fall, right? The Dutch Republic is Protestant, Belgians Catholic. So the Belgians are not happy about this at all, right? So the Belgians see what's going on in France. They're like, hey, I want a piece of that. I also don't like being part of the Dutch Republic. So they revolt, and this is actually successful for them. They establish an independent constitutional monarchy. So good for you, Belgium. You are out from under the control of the Dutch. Now, not as successful in Poland and Italy. So similar motives, though. So Poland, right, as a result of the Congress of Vienna, is mostly under the control of Russia. Kind of theoretically, they're independent, but not practically. And then Italy's actually split up. So Italy, kind of like what we talked about all the way back at the Renaissance, they're made up of a bunch of small nation states. Some of these are independent. Some of them are under the control of Austria. So northern Italy borders Austria at this time, so little states in northern Italy are under the control of Austria. So in both countries, we see nationalist revolts in an effort to overthrow their, controllers, right? So Italian nationalists lead an uprising not only to sort of get Austria out, they also want to unify as one country, but Austria crushes the revolt. Similarly, Poland tries to gain independence from Russia, but Russian troops come down and smack that uprising down and then tighten control over Poland. So Belgium successful, Poland, Italy, not so much. Right. So Britain, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, they're kind of left out of this whole revolutionary wave. Well, what's going on here? So part of this has to do with the fact that they've got a pretty stable parliamentary democracy, so that facilitates their industrialization, and it kind of keeps them out of the fire that's happening on continental Europe. So what's actually interesting here, though, is the Whigs, who come to power in the 1830 elections, do seem to be kind of looking at what's happening on the continent, and they're like, okay, well, I don't really want to experience that. I don't want the poor people to revolt. So why don't we implement some reforms that will keep them happy and satisfied so they won't revolt? So one of those is the Reform Act of 1832, and what this does is it gives more people the vote, so it enfranchises more people. So it gives people the vote in these new industrial cities and towns. But it doesn't extend the vote to everybody. So it doesn't extend the vote to the working class. So it keeps property qualifications for voting. So if you want to vote, you need to own land, you need to own a factory. So it benefits the middle class, but not so much the working class. So that's, again, one of those traits of liberalism, right? They want greater participation, greater political freedom, but they kind of ignore the needs of the working class, right? So in addition to the Reform Act, that's a great example of political liberalism. We also see some of that economic liberalism creeping in as well. So the Corn Laws are repealed in favor of free trade. We know liberals like free trade, right? But we see some of that kind of weird disrespect for the working class in there as well. So the Poor Law of 1834, rather than actually care for poor people, forced them into workhouses. So these were like communal living situations where they basically forced you to work. The Poor Law also limited like aid and welfare. So the idea was like, how do we improve the situation of the poor? Force them to get jobs. Is that really reform? Kind of depends on how you look at it, right? So is it really helping out the working class? Not so much. Right. So now we're going to fast forward ahead. We're going to look at, so that was the 1830 revolutions with a little detour in Britain. Now we're going to look at the 1848 revolutions. This is an even bigger wave of revolutions. And again, it's going to start in France. And actually, one of sort of the weirdest things about the 1848 revolutions in France is it's almost a straight repeat of the OG French Revolution. Like, people during this time were like, wait a minute, we've seen this all happen before. So what do I mean when I say that? Well, we got a monarchy being overthrown. It's replaced with an ineffectual, sad republic, thankfully with less guillotines this time. And then that republic is overthrown by a Napoleon. Seen this before, right? And it even starts the same way as the OG French Revolution. Not quite as dramatically, but so what happens is it's all about sort of economic hardship. So there's an economic recession, there's a poor harvest that leads to famine and economic hardship. Again, it hits kind of the lower middle and working classes the hardest, just like it did in the OG French Revolution. These people are unhappy, right? And then we've got this additional angle of Louis Philippe, right? So he's kind of like this allegedly semi-liberal king, right? But he turns out to be not that liberal, right? He's super corrupt. As I mentioned, he imposed things like censorship. So not that liberal. Liberals were not satisfied with him. And then you've got this whole sort of more radical reform group. You've got radical Republicans who want to completely do away with the constitutional monarchy and go for a full republic. And then you've got the socialists, right? We haven't talked about them too much because they're kind of coming into their own in the early 19th century, but they're going to get bigger later on. So we'll talk about them a lot more next unit as they develop. But these folks want just to get rid of the monarchy and fix things completely. And of course, they also want greater economic equality. That's sort of their deal as well. So in February of 1848, we've got the overthrow of the monarchy. Louis Philippe is overthrown, and he is replaced by a republic. Again, we've seen this before, right? What does that republic start to do? Well, it's provisional government, technically, and they start to draft a new constitution. Again, we have seen this before. All right, so problem, though. Similar to the OG French Revolution, we've got moderates and radicals, and their interests are not the same. So we've got some kind of moderate Republicans, we've got some radical Republicans, we've got one token socialist, but they can't really agree on what to do. So kind of our moderate, middle class, bourgeois liberals or sort of factory owner types, they want some moderate reforms. But then we've got radical Republicans and socialists who want all kinds of like they want economic equality, right? Which we know isn't really a goal of liberals. So one of the things, for example, that they wanted is they wanted full employment. So like, why don't we just create these national workshops that give jobs to everybody? And just kind of a fun side note, this was actually a policy proposal of Bernie Sanders in the 2020 Democratic primaries. So just a little echo there. So they actually do create these workshops, but the moderates are like, nah, I don't like these. I don't like this much government involvement in the economy. This is not good. The working class revolts. And bourgeois liberals violently suppress that revolt. So this is the part where it kind of deviates from the OG French Revolution. We don't have the radicals take over. We actually have the moderates take over. But it ends just as badly. So France does, at the same time, they do say, hey, we're a republic now, and create a constitution. So what they do is they kind of looked at the directory from the last French Revolution. They're like, well, that didn't work. So they create a strong president this time and a one-house legislature. And they do have some kind of classic political liberal policies here. They extend the vote to all adult males without consideration of property qualifications. So it does extend the right to vote to kind of more poor people, which is pretty good. All right. But here's where it gets kind of dicey. We've got a strong president, right? Who do French voters elect to that position? Well, one of the candidates is this gentleman here, Louis Napoleon. He's the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Why do people vote for him? Because his name is Napoleon. Okay, it's a little bit more than that, right? So when things are really chaotic, people tend to like the candidate who comes in who's like, I'm going to calm things down. I'm going to promote law and order. There won't be any more crazy fighting in the streets. And Louis Napoleon does that. And so kind of that policy promise, plus his famous name, people still have kind of fond memories of the original Napoleon. He gets elected. And what does he do? Exactly what his uncle did. He declares himself emperor, and he founds the Second Empire. Yes, I know the names are really confusing. It is really messy. So there's a fun quote about this. It's from a whole essay about this event. It's history repeats itself first as tragedy, then as farce. So history repeats itself, but when it repeats itself, it's kind of dumb. It's a farce the second time around. And Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, the number's so weird, I know. He is dumb Napoleon. There's a story I know about him where he was apparently terrified of cats. And so if a cat came into the room, he'd jump up on a chair and scream like a little girl. Also, real hard to pull off that mustache. All right, so that's France. Let's go elsewhere now. Let's talk about 1848 in the German states. So again here, kind of the theme in Germany, right, is that we've got nationalists really participating in these revolutions. And what do they want? They want a unified Germany, right? So Germany's all these different little states. And again, they're kind of looking towards Prussia. Why Prussia? Prussia maybe seemed kind of, they was powerful. They seemed kind of liberal. So that's where we're going here, right? So when the 1848 revolutions erupt in Germany, German rulers are initially kind of positive. They're like, yeah, sure, you want a constitution? Sure, maybe we'll give you that. Maybe we'll work towards a unified Germany. So again, kind of Frederick William IV of Prussia is like, cool, I'll abolish censorship. I'll work towards a new constitution. I'll work towards a unified Germany. And it was like, great, awesome. So these German states allow elections to this thing called the Frankfurt Assembly, which is this group that was actually organized to write a new constitution for a new unified Germany. Cool. Oh my gosh, exactly what everybody wants, right? So what happens? Well, the delegates write a new constitution, but their efforts at unifying Germany stall when Prussia withdraws from the effort. Prussia gets cold feet, and they're like, no, thank you. I like being extremely powerful and all by myself. And the effort fails. By the way, next unit, we'll see Prussia's feet will warm back up, and they will come back into this. But for now, they're like, no, thank you. Right. So now let's talk about Italy. Kind of similar thing, right? We've got here, nationalism is going to play a really strong role. So again, we're seeing that theme here, where kind of liberalism is going to play a real strong role in France's revolt. We'll see liberalism and nationalism, but especially nationalism, play a role outside of France, right? So in Italy, we've got this guy named Giuseppe Mazzini. He has this movement called Young Italy, and his whole shtick is he wants to rebel and he wants unification for all the various Italian states, right? But problem. So unlike in the German states, German states weren't super successful, right? But these revolts are even less successful. And the problem here isn't because we've got like one state getting cold feet and backing out of the whole situation. The problem here is outside interference, just like in 1830, right? Where we've actually got kind of a bigger coalition. So Austria comes in, they help crush some revolts. France actually steps in and helps crush some revolts. And the only Italian city-state or Italian state that is able to sort of make any gains is Piedmont, which revolts and gains a constitution. And again, kind of like with Germany, put a pin in this. Piedmont will come back in a big way next unit. All right. Now, Austria actually has some problems of its own, though. So, and again, those problems are nationalism. So they stamp down a nationalist revolt, but when they go home, problems there. So the issue here is Hungary, right? So we know Austria is this multi-ethnic sort of empire. We've got Austria proper itself, but there's places like Bohemia. We saw them get smacked all the way back when we talked about the 30 Years' War. But sort of the big power player here is Hungary. So what happens is Hungary wants to become a commonwealth. So what's weird about Hungary is they're actually okay with being part of the empire. They're okay with the Habsburg monarchy, but they're like, hey, we want a little bit of independence. So we want to be part of the Habsburg monarchy still, but we want our own legislature. And kind of, again, like in the 30 Years' War, we see over in Bohemia, the people, they want something similar right here. So kind of similar to the other revolutions, liberalism does play a role here. So we actually do see people in Austria proper kind of look at what's happening in Hungary and Bohemia and be like, hey, that seems kind of cool. And they call for a new liberal constitution. And the Austrian government initially agrees to these demands. It's kind of a funky situation here. The Habsburg emperor at the time is not 100% with it, so he's not really sure what's happening. He sees people revolting outside his window, and he's like, why are those people being so loud? So he does agree at first, but then he backs out, and Austria brings in Russian troops to crush the revolt, and the Habsburgs regain their power.